Peculiar People podcast. There have been a slight change of plans in the schedule, so that the episode we had planned to air will not go up today, but we wanted to re-air this episode of 15 Things You Should Know About David Livingstone. There's some interesting facts that you might find interesting, so we hope you will enjoy. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the missionary Dr. David Livingstone. Now, I came across a website that has 15 things you didn't know about Dr. Livingstone, and I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about these and see how many of them you knew, if you agree with them, and just kind of go along those lines, just something a little bit different, but that's what we're going to do. So let's start with number 1. So the number one, or first thing, that you may not know about Dr. Livingstone is that Africa was his plan B. This fact I did know. Quick, I guess, overview of David Livingstone in case you're not familiar with him. David Livingstone was a Scottish explorer. He was also an abolitionist and a physician, so he literally was a doctor, who wanted to go to China as a missionary, but I think it was the Opium Wars broke out, and so his plans were changed, and instead he decided to go to Africa. There wasn't, I don't think a war happening in Africa at the time. There was a great need for medical people, in particular in Africa, and missionaries, and so he changed his focus, his field, and went there. Now, I'm not seeing this fact popping up here. It might, but I'm going to go ahead and say it just in case it wasn't. But if I remember correctly, David had married the daughter of Robert Moffat, who was, and is still today, a very well-known missionary in Africa. So he ended up marrying Robert Moffat's daughter, which may have also been an incentive or an encouragement to go to Africa as well. Now, the second fact that they have is that Livingstone was a terrible missionary. Now, their reasons for saying this is that he moved to Africa in 1841 as a medical missionary. However, he believed his spiritual calling lay in exploration, with the aim of finding commercial trade routes to displace those of the slave trade rather than preaching. And he did eventually resign from the London Missionary Society. So we have that name missionary pinned on Livingstone, and many people, myself included, I do consider him a missionary. There are people who do lots of medical missions, but they don't preach. That's not what they do. But they're a tool for maybe a missionary who does preach to share the gospel. There's a group that goes every year to the Amazon, and some of the people who are there, their main focus is medical missions to help with eye issues, teeth, dental issues, any of those things. But it's a way to open doors so that the missionary who lives in that area can come then and try to reach the people. You've opened the door, so to speak. So while I agree that in the view that we have of missionaries today, Livingstone doesn't keep up to that. He doesn't meet that standard. But I still think he opened doors for other people, and we might talk about that more here later on. But let me go to the next one. Number 3 is that Livingstone found the cure for malaria. Now, this is a fact that I hadn't heard. I don't believe it. If I have, it's been a long time ago. But Livingstone, of course, living in Africa, he would have dealt with malaria, diphtheria. There's yellow fevers is in some areas, lots of different diseases, and he is the one who suggested the association between mosquitoes and malaria. And so he also observed that tick bites and other things were associated with other diseases as well. So I'm not sure how their example here isn't really showing that he found the cure for malaria. maybe there's more I don't know, but at least that he's showing the connection, the reason why people get malaria, because that's an important factor. I lived in Africa. I somehow managed not to get malaria, even though I was bitten by lots of mosquitoes. But things like mosquito nets are very useful, especially at night. Um, Taking certain medications to help your immune system to fight that off are very important. So he at least found that connection, which is awesome. Number 4, he traveled lightly. Most European explorations, they wanted to feel they wanted the comforts of home. It's like kind of two extremes you might think now is someone who has a 18, 24-foot camper trailer or a 30-foot, however big they are, motorhome traveling compared to someone who is living out of their vehicle, putting a bed in their vehicle. They're traveling very differently. Many Europeans wanted to travel with more comfort along the way, and he would travel with just a few servants and porters, and he would barter for supplies along the way. So instead of buying it in bulk along the way, or beforehand, he would just buy along the way, which is awesome. But also talking about that, number 5 they have is that Livingstone was a disorganized expedition leader. One of the reasons for this is he was criticized by some exploration members for being secretive, self-righteous, and moody. His physician, John Kirk, wrote in 1862, "I can come to no other conclusion than that Dr. Livingstone is out of his mind and a most unsafe leader." Following the death of his wife and loss of some of his assistants who either deserted him or perished, Livingstone uttered his most famous quote, "I am prepared to go anywhere, provided it be forward." So, I don't know if I want to say he's a very ambitious man. He had a focus. Maybe that might be what we want to say. He has a focus. And sometimes guys who are very focused have trouble explaining to people what their focus is. Maybe it's not easy for them to clarify. I wasn't there. I haven't read enough about his expeditions to clearly answer a comment on this question, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt on this one and move onward. Number 6, he was outspoken against slavery. According to Livingstone, his thought on the only way to fight the slave trade in Africa was through Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Now, something he did do is his letters, books, journals, they were getting sent back to Europe constantly, back to the UK, what we now know as the UK, and they were drawing public support for the abolition of slavery. So even though he was he was in Africa seeing what was happening, his works, his writings were able to affect people back home. Number 7, Livingstone was famous in his own time. He was a celebrity. When he would come back to the UK for a couple times, I don't remember how many times he came back, but during those visits back, he would be given a gold medal from the Royal Geographical Society, an honorary doctorate from Harvard, or sorry, not from Harvard, from Oxford. Wrong country. He got a private audience with Queen Victoria, and there's just people everywhere. Where he would go, crowds of people. You know, you've heard about him through his letters, through things being published in publications, but now getting to meet him. It's just like people today, you know, especially, but the difference is that photographs were a little bit more limited. You know, there were photographs, but it's a little more limited how many you could see of a person. You didn't have your cell phone to snap a picture, but being able to see him in person would have been cool. Number 8 is he had one regret. He married Mary Moffat, and they were married for about 17 years, but his one regret later in life is that he didn't spend enough time with his children. He would have 4 children altogether, and that was one of his regrets. And I think one of his sons ended up getting in big trouble in the U.S. during the Civil War. I don't remember the details on that exactly, but that is one of his one regret. Number 9 is that Livingstone suffered failures. Now, Livingstone is considered one of history's greatest explorers, um, but his last two expeditions were considered failures in their chief aims. He was trying to find a navigable river that cut across southern Africa, and in his last he was looking for the source of the Nile, neither of which he was able to do. Number 10, he was haunted by what he witnessed. During his search for the Nile, he witnessed a slave massacre at Ningui, where some 400 people were killed. And that would affect anyone, but especially this man. It would make sense that it would bother him. Number 11, most people know, is that Livingstone disappeared for 6 years. Now, if you've looked at a map, you realize Africa is a huge continent, but he completely lost contact with the outside world for 6 years, and we don't know if he's even alive until journalist Henry Stanley was sent to Africa to find Livingstone, because, for 6 years, your chief, maybe not your chief, but one of your forms of editorials, articles, is gone. You have nothing to write about David Livingstone because you have no material coming in. And so they sent Stanley to find Livingstone, and he found him and uttered these famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Now, talking about that, number 12, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, was a clever headline, but may have been fabricated. Who remembers the first thing they say to someone? You may, technically, you might remember, but he was also the only white person for miles and miles around, so, yes, who else would it be? But they're not totally sure that it was the actual first sentence, just a good headline. Number 13, his heart is literally in Africa. When David Livingstone died from diphtheria and malaria, that combination, on May 1st, 1873, at the age of 60, the chief in a village North Rhodesia, now Zambia, had his heart removed and buried it under a tree, now the site of the Livingstone Memorial. But his remains were sent back to the UK, and were buried at Westminster Abbey. Number 14, his legacy is prolific. Although Livingstone was wrong about a lot of things, like the source of the Nile, some other things, the fact that he found Victoria Falls, first European to have seen it, his observations enabled large regions of Africa to be mapped, which had previously been blank, to open up Africa to more people. We can discuss if that's a good thing or bad thing, but we'll leave it there. Number 15, Livingstone inspired other explorers. But not only explorers. You got to realize people who are listening to David Livingstone are thinking of him still as a missionary. Now, today, we would maybe be a little more skeptical, because, hey, all you're doing is traveling around, we're not hearing of any meetings, of any people getting saved, of any witnessing happening, but he inspired others, for sure. One of the people that he inspired was Mary Slessor, who I want to do an episode about at some point, who decided to follow the footsteps of her hero, and in 1875 arrived in Calabar, which is present-day Nigeria. The founder of the Africa Inland Mission, Peter Cameron Scott, was inspired to return to Africa after his first mission failed, when he read the inscription on Livingstone's tomb in Westminster Abbey, which reads, "Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring." So it's easy to think, oh, David Livingstone wasn't a good missionary, or he was just an explorer. There's lots of things we could think. But his impact on people who have been interested in going to the mission field since his life and then his death it's amazing, the amount of people who've been willing to go. So those people who've gone, who focus more on evangelism, have been able to reach much of Africa. He helped open up Africa so that missionaries, future missionaries, knew where to go. Were able to go deeper into Africa, not just to the borders along the sea, but to go inland and reach people in Nigeria and Zambia who hadn't been reached because no one knew where to go or how to get there. But he opened that up so people were able to do that. And so today we have hundreds and thousands of missionaries, maybe not thousands, hundreds of thousands, but thousands of missionaries who are in Africa to reach the lost, as an impact, one, of maybe having heard about David Livingstone, or because he helped to open up the continent so that people were able to go. So I'm not the biggest fan of David Livingstone, but I do like the fact that he helped missionaries be able to get into Africa to reach the lost. Thank you for once again listening to this re-airing of a podcast. If you have any questions for us about God's Peculiar People, please contact us on Instagram or at the email in the description below. See you next week with another episode of the God's Peculiar People podcast.